Welcome back, guys, to Science to Go. Today we're going to be talking about some basic fundamental things to learn to get you ready and prepared to start learning furthermore about biochemistry. So today we're going to be going over some simple things around organic compounds, right? We're not going to go fully in depth today, but we're just going to give a basic and general widespread view of it so you can kind of get an understanding of what it may be and what to expect when you're later on going into your classes, or if you just want a little bit of a summary based off what you may be learning in class. So first, before we kind of go into each little section here, let's just go about the name first, right? So we see organic compounds. What does that even mean, right? So we're going to go step by step through this. So let's just take a look at the word organic first, right? So before we take a look at the word organic, we're going to look at what an element is. So what an element is in science is it's just essentially the purest form of any known material. Now, the best way to look at this is if you think about it as if you're looking at it from the perspective of a cell, right? A cell essentially is the basic building block of all life. It's very, it's the kind of the root. It's like the foundation of what makes things bigger and expands as it progresses on. So you can think of an element as the most purest form, the most smallest form of something that makes itself bigger. So an example to this could be something like carbon, right? Or maybe hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. Things like, simple molecules. You can take a look at the periodic table if you want to go more in depth. And then now let's take a look at compounds. So what is a compound? And all a compound is, it's pretty simple. It's just a group of combined elements, right? So it kind of gets into you can see kind of the relationship here, how we have elements that are the purest form, and then we're just combining them to make a further bigger thing called the compound, kind of, combining all of this. And oxygen and sometimes nitrogen. Now, the main thing to look at again is just carbon, right? If it has carbon, it's a huge lean towards organic. Sometimes it will have nitrogen. Typically, nitrogen can actually kind of serve as both organic and inorganic, so it's kind of like a fluctuating basis, but typically you'll just need to know that there's carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Now, for inorganic, you'll see main things of H2O, CO2, some acids, and some salts. But again, main thing to keep in your mind is really H2O and CO2. That's kind of like the huge main things that are going to tell you something is inorganic. And essentially, that's all you need to know for this portion, but you'll be able to kind of combine your knowledge now and say, okay, an organic thing, right, has to have carbon in it, hydrogen and oxygen, sometimes nitrogen, and compounds are just a group of elements. So let's take a look here at our best friend here, proteins. Now, you may probably heard of proteins many times before, right? You've heard of protein powder, you've heard of, how you should probably eat more fish because it contains lots of good proteins for you, different kinds of meats and stuff like that. So proteins are generally very, very important, and we hear about them all the time, but what do they really do, and why are they important to us and for us to consume? So you see, proteins have a lot of functions in our own body. They serve as hormones, they also serve as enzymes, and they play a huge role in many things of structure. Now, there's obviously a little bit more things to it, but those are the main ones that you're going to be hearing a lot about and how there's going to be playing a big role, because obviously hormones and enzymes are a part of many different systems and how your body maintains homeostasis in well. So the structure part of proteins is that they really help build the actual structure itself of all your different organs to make up your organ systems, and they help build the foundation, right? They're builders essentially, and they're helping our body build up as one, right? So now that we understand the functions of proteins, let's take a look at the monomer, or otherwise known as the basic building block. So monomer and basic building block stand for the same thing, that they have the same meaning, and all that they are is essentially, think about it like this, right? It's the element of the compound. So in this case, a monomer is is the basic foundation of what makes up that compound, and in this case for proteins it would be amino acids. So amino acids, right, they essentially build and help shape proteins. So the way they actually do this is they undergo a process called protein synthesis. Now, we're not going to go fully in depth on that actual process today because it would make the video too long, but protein synthesis is essentially taking your genetic code, transferring it so that we can take the DNA side of the whole entire part of your body into the genetic code and translate it so we can bring it to the ribosome for the shapes and different types of amino acids that we need to form into one long chain. And another important thing to know about this is the sequence of amino acids and how they kind of coordinate along with another influence the shape of the protein, which affects the function. So they serve as the basic foundation for proteins, okay? Now, let's take a peek at what a protein would actually look like, okay? So in terms of a protein, what you would typically see is you would see something like this. So you see your hydrogen here bonded to a nitrogen, back down to a hydrogen, and then you would see a carbon, and then your R group, which we'll talk about that in a second here, down to a hydrogen, and then up over here to another carbon, to an oxygen, and then to an OH. So this section right here is known as the amine group, or amine, whatever way you want to pronounce it, but it's the amine group. Now, this will be one of the factors that will help you identify whether you're looking at a protein or not. So the amine group will typically have the H and H, essentially, and it'll be on the left side. Typically, as there's many different types of amino acids, right? So there's 20 different kinds of amino acids, and each of them are a little bit differently, and they majorly differ in the R side chain, or the R group. So each protein essentially has different amino acids that code for it, right, that build itself. And there's 20 different kinds, as we said. So the main thing you'll be able to identify here is there's going to be different types of groups. So we saw that we have the amine group right here, we have the R group right here, and we have what is known as the CHU group, or otherwise known as the carboxylic group. So the carboxylic group will be a huge dead giveaway that you're looking at a protein, okay? Because it'll just, you can kind of see, we say it's CHU because it has the C, the H, and then 2 O, so it's CHU, it makes that kind of sound. And you'll be able to identify it very quickly by just looking to see if there's a CHU group involved in the actual diagram itself. Now the R group is going to be a little bit different, because as there's 20 different kinds of amino acids, they all differ through the R side chain. So each of the amino acids R side chain is going to be different. It's going to have different kind of molecules and different kind of elements that make it up. So you won't necessarily be able to identify if it's a protein based off the R side chain, because it'll be a little bit more difficult as there's many different kinds of amino acids, but you'll really be able to, as long as you understand that there's the CHU group, and you can kind of find the amine group. So that those are the two main ones that you'll be able to identify really well. But essentially that is all you'll have to do, and just take a look at that. Now, along with these 4 different organic compounds, they actually all have their own types of bonding, right? So they bond to one another to make up bigger things, and in proteins it's called a peptide bond. Now today we're not going to go fully in depth on that, because it would make the video too long, and essentially wouldn't be able to help you if you kind of put all this information right into your head. So we're just going to go step by step. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to help you get notified when I'm posting. That way you'll be able to slowly and kind of gather your knowledge quickly. So now let's go take a look at carbohydrates. Now carbohydrates, right? Very cool, because we hear them all the time, right? You will typically hear someone going to the store and you'll say, oh, I gotta start eating more carbs, or maybe less. Typically whatever the person's diet may consist of. So people love eating carbs, right? They're very good. So we see them in foods like potatoes, chips, bread, pasta, things like that. A lot of good stuff. So why do we eat carbs though, right? Do they help us at all? Do they not help us? What's the point of the carbs? Well, you see, carbs serve as a main energy source, because they help us store lots of energy, right? Because we obviously need energy as humans to function daily and go to different activities, run, walk, etc. So we really need energy. They help us give us lots of energy. So think about whenever you're hearing about carbohydrates, just think about energy, right? They're giving us lots of energy and helping us store that energy. Now, so essentially we looked at the monomer of protein, so let's look at the monomers of carbohydrates. Now the monomer is going to be glucose, or otherwise known as simple sugars. So glucose is essentially just another term for simple sugars, and another thing that'll kind of help you identify if you're talking about a carbohydrate or not is you'll notice that a lot of the terms when you're talking about different sugars and carbohydrates, they'll end in OSE, because there's even another sugar called sucrose. And again, you see that same types of ending, OSE. So that'll be another factor that will help you identify whether you're looking at a carbohydrate or not. Let's take a peek at what a carbohydrate would actually look like in terms of, what a glucose molecule might consist of. So essentially what you would see is you'd have like a hydrogen here, you have your carbon, and then you would bond up to another carbon, to a CH2, and then bond it once again to an oxygen, over here to a carbon, to a hydrogen, and then you'd have an OH right over here. Again, another carbon here with an H, and then an OH. And then once again, another bonding to a carbon with an H and an OH here. So we just kind of flip them essentially. And then we see another bonding back up to the original carbon with an OH over here. So it's kind of a little bit more complex when you're looking at it in perspective towards a protein, but essentially it's very noticeable as well because you see there's lots of carbon, right? So that's another dead giveaway, right? We talked about how organic compounds will always have carbon in it, and therefore you can kind of see always lots of carbon. So carbon really gives you a good giveaway that it's an organic compound. Another thing you'll typically hear about carbohydrates, and they might ask you lots of questions on this, they'll say, okay, so what is the ratio for carbohydrates, sorry. And you'll probably be like, what do you mean, what ratio? Well, the ratio for carbohydrates is 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen. Now what this means is that for every 2 hydrogen that we have 1 oxygen along with it. So it's a 2 to 1 ratio. So you'll be asked this typically sometimes. It'll just be a generic question that they may ask you, so it'll be good to know this. Now, carbohydrates also, along with proteins, that we talked about how proteins have a peptide bond, carbohydrates have things like monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Again, we're not going to go fully in depth just to make sure that the video isn't too long. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at nucleic acids. Now, what are nucleic acids? Well, nucleic acids have a lot to do with your genetic code, with your DNA and RNA. Now, the monomers of nucleic acids are called nucleotides. Pretty cool word to say, pretty fun. But nucleotides, there's 2 of them, right? We have DNA and we have RNA. So we know we have nucleotides, right? We have DNA and we have RNA. Now what's the difference between the 2? Because we understand that DNA is very popular, right? It's the DNA, it's a genetic code, it's what makes us us, gives us the eye color that we have, gives us the hair color, etc. What makes us any different from RNA? Well, you see, DNA cannot leave the nucleus, and RNA can. Now, you might be saying, well, why? Why can one leave and why cannot? You see, because DNA, it's essentially its home is just in the nucleus of a cell. Of every cell, it's in the nucleus. And it cannot leave because it is too large of a molecule to actually leave the nuclear membrane and kind of make its way through different parts of the cell itself. So the reason why we cannot leave is, right, it's too big. So we have to have RNA, which is smaller because it's essentially it's a single strand copy of DNA that helps it leave the actual membrane because it's smaller. So RNA has the ability to leave, and the reason why it's beneficial for the RNA to leave and have genetic code being transported along the cell is because we can go to different parts like the ribosome to help us make proteins. So when we talk about the protein synthesis a little bit, this is where you would really see a huge portion of how RNA and DNA kind of work alongside one another to make something like proteins, for example. So again, we'll get more in depth into a different video, but DNA and RNA, most important thing to know about these is that DNA cannot leave and RNA can. So a nucleotide is going to look something like this. You're going to have a phosphate right over here, and I'm just kind of putting the P right there so you can just get a visual of it. A phosphate right here, and then you're going to see a deoxyribo sugar, right? So your sugar up here, and then you're going to have a section right here, which will be your nitrogenous base. Okay, so what we're seeing here is just a single nucleotide. We have a phosphate group, we have a deoxyribo sugar, and we have a nitrogenous base. Now, what do these all mean, right? What's their purpose and what do they stand for? Well, essentially, your phosphates are going to essentially just be the backbone of a ladder-like structure, right? Because we know that DNA is a double helix, and a lot of people refer to a ladder for an example of it. So think of your phosphates they're going to be like the handles, essentially, of the sides of the ladder that's going to help you climb up. And the actual steps themselves are going to be the nitrogenous bases. Now, there's 4 nitrogen bases. They're called adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and each one pairs with a partner. So adenine pairs with thymine, and guanine pairs with cytosine. So every time you're going to see, for example, if you saw adenine here, you're going to see thymine over here, and thus 4. If you saw guanine here, you're going to see cytosine here, and the reverse is also correct. So that's going to kind of be a basic structure of what you would see. Now, the only thing that differs essentially from DNA and RNA is that RNA is 1 strand and DNA is 2 strands, so you wouldn't have the double helix in RNA. In RNA, instead of having thymine, it's going to have uracil, right? U for uracil. And it's going to be the generic basic structure of nucleic acids and nucleotides. So again, we're not going to go fully in depth. We're going to go in depth in a different video. But that essentially is all you need to know for now about what nucleic acids are. They serve mainly in the genetic code. So whenever you're thinking about nucleic acids, just think, your genes, your DNA, things like that, and the genetic diversity. Now we're going to go on and take a look at lipids. Now, lipids are pretty cool, right? They're essentially all they are is just fats. So things like oil, for example, right? Lipids are pretty cool because they are essentially, out of all of these different compounds, they hold the most energy. I know we talked about how carbohydrates hold the most energy, but actually lipids beat carbohydrates to it. So let's take a look here, right? What is the monomer of lipids? Well, the monomer of lipids is actually, there's two of them. You're going to have glycerol plus fatty acids, right? So these two make up lipids. They're the monomers of lipids. And essentially, why are we going to say that lipids have more energy than carbohydrates? And that's because lipids actually have more carbon. And when a molecule has more carbon, the more potential it has to store energy. And therefore, since it has more carbon than carbohydrates, it stores more energy, right? Gotta love the energy. We all want energy, and that's kind of what we use for lipids. So now let's take a peek at what a fatty acid would look like, right? So a fatty acid is going to have a OH here. It's going to have a carbon to an OH back here, and then we're going to drop down to a hydrogen. Again, carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen, another carbon down here with a hydrogen up top, and another hydrogen. So a good way to remember fatty acids, right, is because you can kind of see how it's going in one single direction across, right? It's kind of like this long stick, I guess you could say. So your fatty acids are going to be like this long stick, and your glycerol is going to be kind of the total opposite. It's going to go up and down. So glycerol is going to be a little bit different. It's going to consist of a hydrogen up here, to a carbon, to a hydrogen, to an OH, and then down to a carbon, to a hydrogen, and then to an OH, and then to a carbon, hydrogen, and OH, and then just end off with a hydrogen. So again, you can kind of memorize it by fatty acids are always going to be going from essentially left to right, and glycerol is going to be going from like up to down. So you can kind of picture it, I guess. It's a little bit easier if you just use it that way to help you memorize it, but you'll see essentially it's just a pattern. So that's going to be lipids, right? You're going to see there's two of them, glycerol and fatty acids, and those are the general structures of them. And you can tell there's lots and lots of carbon, and the more carbon a compound has, the more ability it has to store energy. That's going to wrap it up for today's lesson. Thank you for watching. Make sure you guys subscribe and like. That way you'll be notified when we post, so you can furthermore learn and pick up some other things that you may not be getting.